I'll go ahead and get started. I have like 2 minutes and then I'll start. But I did hit the record button so I would not forget today. Okay, I have 12 o'clock, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started because today tends to be a longer chat with more questions. So I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. So today we're gonna talk about tree syrup. Most common tree syrup that we know of is maple syrup, but I'm gonna talk about maple syrup, but also some other ones that we make in Missouri and that you can possibly make if you live in an area that does not have maples. Quick overview, I'm Sarah Havens. I'm the field specialist in natural resources, University of Missouri Extension. I also kind of work as a state coordinator, if you will, for our Women Owning Woodland program. And this program is one that's in the process of being developed, kind of growing as we go, to provide these learning opportunities to women landowners and woodland enthusiasts. We do this through field days, lunch and learns, and classes that are geared towards again, women landowners and woodland enthusiasts. There is a Facebook page if you're looking for, I usually post kind of any upcoming opportunities there as far as my programming, but perhaps other programming that comes from other organizations that might be of interest. Upcoming events. So again, if you're kind of looking for things, February 22nd, March 1st, and March 8th is our Winter Woodland Steward webinar series. So February 22nd, we'll cover carbon credits or carbon markets. March 1st is a forest health update from our friends over at Missouri Department of Conservation. And March 8th is going to be wildlife habitat for some of our non-game species. And that is going to be presented by Brian McGowan, who is from Purdue Extension. So that should be a pretty interesting series. We have one more lunch and learn for the month of February. That is next Friday. If you're looking for a timber sale workshop, I will be doing a woodland steward timber sale workshop in Lebanon Saturday, February 26th. And then another one that's not been added to the calendar, registration's not open. I have to do paperwork for it, but I will be adding one more face-to-face tree sugaring workshop at Wordak Research Farm in Cook Station. So that will be coming up on March 12th. And then registration is not open, but just kind of put on your calendars if you're interested, is in March. Our Women Owning Woodland Lunch and Learns will be on Mondays. So quick overview. So maple syrup is really the original tree syrup, and this is because it has such a high concentration of sugar in its sap. It's not one specific person gets credit for discovering maple syrup, but credit does go to our North American Indian group. They were the first to use and develop this commodity. We do know that it was used as a bartering commodity. Many of our, again, North American Indians that lived along the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. And a little history of it is that it's documented that they would kind of started this is that if they had sap leaking out of a maple tree and it would freeze during the winter, they would eat those sapsicles, essentially, for no better term, because they were just a little bit sweeter than straight water. And then actually, interestingly enough, we developed maple sugar, and that was the more widely used commodity during the during really establishment and settlement by European settlers in the U.S. or North America. And we started with sugar because this was easier to preserve, easier to carry with them. It is actually a little trickier to make maple sugar than maple syrup. So you have to boil it down a little bit further to make it into sugar. But again, during kind of settlement era in North America, there was a tax on cane sugar, which came from, again, kind of like Bahamas area, in areas that grew sugar cane, so tropics. So they actually used maple sugar to avoid paying those taxes for bringing in sugar. And then when those taxes went away and cane sugar became more easily available or readily available, this is when maple syrup actually started to be used more widely than maple sugar. So just kind of interesting history about maple syrup and how it was developed. Maple syrup is, as far as history goes, we are the location of maple trees and sugar maple trees. So it is accredited to North America is where it was developed. The first record of English from the English settlers is from Robert Boyle, who was a chemist, and he talked about New England, about having sugar maple trees and that they had a juice that leaves out that does make a sugary saccharine substance. Tree syrup in Missouri, it is possible. So we do have a program right now called the Missouri Maple Syrup Initiative, and this runs through the University of Missouri. You can find more at mosyrup.com. We received an ACER grant to help with the commercialization specifically of maple syrup, but we'll talk about, because my specialty is actually not maple syrup, but black walnut syrup. And then Missouri Department of Conservation has a guide to backyard sugar mapling, which is a great resource as well. And then there is a Missouri Maple Syrup Facebook page, which is, there's several people on there that do maple, but also some of the other tree species, and so much great advice from producers that we have in Missouri. Where to start? So trees are the first place to start. The best tree is a sugar maple, so it has the highest Brix, so BRIX, and this is really the measurement of sugar in the sap. And so they have the highest amount of sugar in the sap, meaning that we have to boil it down less in order to get syrup or sugar from it. However, we have other species. Sugar maple is the best. We also have other species of maple, such as red maple, silver maple in Missouri, and then other tree species. And like I said, my specialty really lies in black walnut sap and tree syrup. So a quick tree physiology lesson: trees always produce sap, but we only collect spring sap. So in the fall, a tree will go into dormancy, and during this time, the tree will start to store its excess starches in the roots. This is going to become the sugar that we are concentrating from that sap we draw out of the tree. During late winter, and sometimes in Missouri, it's kind of midwinter for us because of our location, But those trees will start to send that stored starch up to the canopy to start leaf making process. And this is the sap that we tap. So during this time, I won't give you too much of a chemistry lesson here, but during this time, that starch stays as a sugar instead of being converted back to a starch. So it maintains that sucrose form, which is how we prefer to consume sugar, is in a sucrose form. So whenever the wood temperature reaches around 40 degrees, this is when those starches go to sugars in the ray cells, and these are cells that are located in the stem of the tree. That sugar then passes into the tree sap so it can move up to the leaves where it can be utilized by the tree. As the temperature increases to about 45 degrees, and this is in the tree, so like next week, we're gonna have days where we hit 60-ish, and most of our trees will still stay at that 40-degree mark, because that will help continue to keep that sugar as a sucrose instead of being converted back to a starch. And so that's the sap that tastes good. Once our tree reaches, it starts to increase above 45 degrees, those enzymes will stop functioning and sugar is no longer produced. And this is when it will change back to a starch. And so as we get to the end of the season, which is really when our trees start to so as soon as the buds start to swell, this is usually the indication that those sugars are going back to starches. There's still sap flowing, of course, in the trees, and actually you'll still likely get some out of a tree, but it will start to have a different taste to it, and it will be better. Rising temperature creates pressure inside the trees, causing sap to flow. Our perfect tapping time or tapping days are days that are above freezing with nights that are below freezing. So as it gets above freezing, that rising temperature creates the pressure that pushes sap flow up through the tree. And then the freezing temperatures at night will push it back down the tree. Wood fibers, when we drill a hole, the wood fibers that have water or sap in them are severed, and the sap will drip out of the tree and into our tap. What does a maple look like? So these are sugar maple and silver maple, which are kind of our two most common tree species. And I should have thrown in what a black walnut looks like in here. Because those, again, if you don't, most of our maple concentration is along the Missouri River and the Mississippi River basin. So if you live other places, it might be more likely that you come across a black walnut than a maple. Syrup yield. So yield of sap varies greatly with the method of tapping, the size of the tree, the species of trees, and the seasonal differences that we find. If you are looking for help getting started, oftentimes you'll see that the sap yield is expressed in terms of number of tap holes rather than the number of trees. So the average yield for a tap hole is anywhere from 5 to 15 gallons, which this is, again, most of our information and research comes for maple trees, because these have been the trees that have been historically tapped for syrup production. If we have really good conditions, a single tap hole can produce as much as 40 to 80 gallons of sap in a single year. And just kind of for information, it takes about 10 gallons of sap to produce a quart of syrup, or 40 to 45 gallons of sap to produce 1 gallon of syrup. That's for maples. For black walnut, we tend to be a little bit higher, so it's usually 50 or 55 gallons of sap will produce one gallon of syrup. Sugar content of the sap also is different from trees. We measured, again, a lot of my experience comes with black walnut, but we had trees right next to each other. They were planted at the same time, same age, same soil conditions, and one had 3-ish bricks to the sap, and then the one right next to it had 0.9. So there's a lot of variety from tree to tree. Again, sugar maple trees, also known as rock or hard maple, are usually our best producers. So they usually have the highest sugar concentration. In fact, there's been a sugar maple that's been developed called a super sweet sugar maple that's been kind of genetically improved upon so that it produces very high Brix content sap. Sugar content can also vary depending on the time of day, and we can measure sugar content. So something called a refractometer can be used to measure the Brix in sap. So you can actually measure it. I've met people who taste the sap and they swear they can tell the difference between high and low Brix concentrations. But for a scientific piece to it, you can actually use a refractometer and measure it. Which trees to tap? So as a general rule of thumb, they should be about 10 inches or greater in diameter at DBH, or 4.5 feet above the ground. And this is, so we are taking some of their stored resources when we collect sap from them. And so we want them to be able to kind of sustain that and do without that sap. So that's why we usually say this 10 inches in diameter. Tapped trees between 10 and 20 inches should have no more than one tap per tree, and then a second tap can be added as you go above to between 20 and 25. And then if you have really large trees, so 25 inches or greater, they can usually sustain 3 taps. We don't want to put anything more than 3 taps in it. So again, this sap is their nourishment for leaf development, bud development, and any type of growth that they have in the crown. So we do not want to take more of those resources than they can sustain. Shape and size of the crown is also important. So trees that tend to have larger crowns that extend kind of downwards are usually our best sap producers. So, and then just a quick look at different, there's lots of different equipment for tapping trees. So you can use a bucket method or some other type of like single collection method, so it all drains into a single container. If you have a lot of trees that you intend to tap in one place, you can certainly utilize a tubing system, and this is very popular, particularly with folks that have a very extensive sugar bush, so they have a lot of trees that they're tapping in the same place. They can set up this system. It does tend to work best if there's some type of grade, so that gravity can help kind of pull that sap down to a container. And then these tubing systems then lead to like a larger containment system. So usually some type of like plastic water, like a 500-gallon collecting tank. So, and again, just a quick look at what DBH looks like. And then those guidelines. So step by step, again, you'll want to order, look consistently if you're ordering equipment, and make sure that you use the same size consistently across, so a drill bit that matches up with the size of your tap. And taps can actually be 3/16, 5/16, or 7/16 in diameter. 5/16 is probably about 7/16 is the most common. I like 5/16 because they make smaller holes that tend to heal a little bit faster. So you just want to make sure that your drill bit size matches your taps that you've purchased. But they do come in different sizes. So something to look at if you're ordering. If you're using a 7/16, you'll want to drill a 2-inch hole. And this is so we want to put our tap in, and if you look at them, they have kind of a graduated, they gradually get bigger, so they'll fit in the hole very tight. We want to leave a little bit of space, so we drill our hole into the tree, and we want to leave a little bit of space behind the tap, and this allows sap to pool in that area and then run through the tap. If your tap is right against where you've drilled to, it's going to prevent sap from flowing into the tap, and it'll tend to like come out around the tap. So just, again, good rules to go by. From year to, if you're going to drill the same trees from year to year, we don't like to bore any closer than 2 feet directly over or under a former tap hole, or closer than 6 inches from the side. So we, on ours that we've been doing at some of our research farms, we have actually, moved completely around, and then we kind of go different places as we are moving. And this is because trees will we say trees seal, they don't heal. And so they're actually going to kind of seal off that hole, which can lead to kind of almost the equivalent of scar tissue, which can minimize sap flow from those areas. So that's why we kind of have distances from old tap holes. Usually a tap hole, so I'll pull taps for my trees usually in late March. And by the time I get back out there in July, they have, already kind of hardened off that wood and started to heal. It's good to use a sharp drill bit to minimize rough wood in your tap hole. This can reduce the amount of sap coming out through the tap. And you can also, it can reduce your sap quality. One thing, and this is just with pruning, I recommend the same, is to clean your drill bit in between trees. So this can help with, again, reducing the possibility of, if one tree has a disease, spreading it to the next one down the line. So, and then drilling. So most time when we put in our first taps, especially, they're going to be done at a convenient for us level, but as you tap trees over and over again, you do have to spread them out. So it tends to kind of be all over, up and down the tree. After you drill your hole, you're going to actually, so that's where the term tapping came from, you're going to tap the spout. So these are called taps. They're sometimes called spiles. You're going to tap that into that hole, and you want it to be tight where it cannot be pulled out by hand. But you don't want to drive it in so hard that you split the tree. And that can happen. And when that happens, it'll still have some sap that comes out of your tap, but you'll also find that it leaks around it because of those splits in the wood. It's also good to tap on warm days when the temperature is above freezing to minimize the risk of splitting the tree. And then this is just to look at some different styles of taps that are out there. So there's plastic ones, and these are ones that usually attach to tubing. Then there's some of the metal ones that are open, and they're going to usually go into some type of individual container and not necessarily the tubing system. You'll hang your bucket or container on the hook of the spout. You can also fashion your own. I've seen also a lot of like plastic tubing. If you have a plastic spile with a tubing system to some type of, again, collection. I personally use a bag system. So it is metal taps that have kind of a hanger on them, and then a metal holder at the top that holds a plastic bag underneath it, and it just goes on the tap. It is open on the sides, but it does, for the most part, keep most of like bark, other dirt. It does unfortunately not keep insects out. So when we get warmer days, we'll have insects that make their way into the sap. But I filter all of my sap before we start the boiling process. So I run it through cheesecloth, which then pulls out any of the bugs that have made their way in there, any bark. This tubing system to a simple container, or if you put them all together into like more of a collection system, I'll give it that is definitely the cleanest way for collecting sap. But whatever works for you. To boil the sap, so it's good to collect it for a period of time. So you have a lot when you start this process, because it takes a lot of sap to make just a little bit of syrup. If you are collecting over time, it is good to either store your sap in a refrigerator or freeze it or keep it in some other cool place, because sap, just like milk, it'll go bad, it will go sour. And so especially if you're tapping just a few trees, it's good to store it somewhere cold. I freeze all of my sap, so we have a deep freeze that is kind of designated as the sap collection, and then that allows me to boil it all at the same time, and none of it will go bad. You can also, as you boil, so you can boil to a certain point, and then you can actually take that partially boiled sap, put it back in the freezer if you run out of time, and then come back to it. So that's, again, something that we've done with some of my extension work with sap making or syrup making, is I don't always have a good 8 or 10 hour day to sit and watch the sap boil. So it's kind of start, stop sometimes. but it's possible. I have not seen, I shouldn't say not ever, but most producers of syrup in Missouri, it seems like everybody has a different setup. I started with this, there's kind of picture down here. I started with a propane fired turkey, like turkey fryer is what it was. And then I used, a big stainless pot that fit on it, and that's how I boiled to start with. Recently, we have added a kind of more like this one that you see here, so a brick type of fireplace that we boil on. It does affect the taste of your syrup just a little, so wood fired, it's kind of hard to avoid any of that smoke getting into your syrup, so it gives a little more smoky taste, whereas propane, again, it doesn't really have any wood burning flavor to it. Wood is cheaper than propane, so that's why a lot of producers will use wood, because firewood is cheaper than buying the propane that needed to run a boiler for a long period of time. And just, you want to make sure that whatever selected fuel you have it in ample supply, because it does take a while. Flat pans are usually the best. So like I said, I started with this method of a big pan. It does take a little bit longer. So flat pans have more surface area, so it tends to evaporate and boil off a little bit quicker than if you're in kind of this tall, metal container. I don't recommend cooking your syrup indoors unless you have a dehumidifier or a stove vent fan. It does create a lot of steam. Even this week, I had some sap that I really needed to get processed, so I actually used a roasting pan to cook it down. And my house was kind of like a greenhouse. It was very, very humid, and my windows were all drippy. So just a word of caution: it can be done, but it does create a lot of humidity in your house. Once your sap starts to run, you just want to make sure you've collected enough to fill your pan, and then you're ready for that fire. You don't want to fill your pan to the top because it will boil over. And as your sap starts to convert over to syrup, so thicker, it will sometimes like boil up. And a little bit of if you spray just a little bit of cooking spray or put a little bit of butter in that will prevent a lot of those boil overs. With my outdoor system, I boil off most of my sap to about 1.5 inches in the pan. And then at this point, I will pour it into a pan and usually bring it inside to finish it on the stove. I just said not to boil in house, but once you get to the end where you're just about finished, you're not boiling off quite as much water. So it doesn't create quite as much humidity. And bringing it into like a kitchen stove gives you a little bit more control, so you can get it. If you go too far past the point, you'll start to have a lot more sugar crystals form, and it won't be as much syrup. So just kind of hitting that sweet spot is a little bit easier on my stove in the house. You don't want to leave boiling sap over a wood fire unattended. It can quickly boil away and burn your pan, and then you have a really large scorched pan to clean up, which can be difficult. Again, especially like next week. So next week, I think we have Monday, we're supposed to get up to like 67. So if you are collecting, it's good to collect every day when we're particularly in the 60s. So again, it will sour if you leave it in the sun. And then you want to store it in cold storage so that you can boil it later. Sap becomes finished maple syrup when it reaches 66 to 67% sugar content, and it's 7.1 degrees above the temperature of boiling water. So some people do a couple different ways to test it to make sure that it's converted from maple syrup or maple sap to maple syrup, or black walnut to black walnut syrup. So you can buy a refractometer. And so you have to be careful when you order them, because there are sap refractometers, and those measure bricks of sap. So they only usually range from 0 to 10 or 0 to 32, which won't catch our bricks for syrup because we want that to be like 66 to 67. So there are actually syrup refractometers that will measure up higher bricks numbers. So that works for it. You can also just kind of using I use an old-fashioned candy thermometer, and as soon as I reach 219.1, which sometimes is hard to read, so as soon as I usually get to 219, I'm like, okay, I'm pretty much there. That is when we are now considered syrup. So it's useful to have. If you have a really large operation, you might, so if you're boiling a lot of syrup all the time, you might consider what's called a syrup hydrometer and testing cup. So as your syrup is boiling, you're going to use that cup and scoop out some of that syrup and then put that hydrometer in it. And that's going to give you the density. And so if it's boiled over 68.9% density, then that's when sugar crystals will form in your storage containers. The hydrometer is probably the most accurate method of determining sugar concentration, but it is an investment if you're only, making a little bit of syrup each year. Syrup does tend to have different, so even if we boil it, all to the same temperature and same conditions, we do see kind of differences in color and taste as we go throughout the season. And this often depends on meteorologic conditions, if we've had a lot of rain, if it's been really dry, if we've had a lot of warmer days versus more of our cooler days. But as a general rule, our syrup will change colors going from a lighter color to a very darker, stronger color at the end of the season. So this is a look at maple grades. So if you buy maple syrup, they usually give you like a grade on it. So, and it used to be great. So these two in the middle are the ones that are usually sold for human consumption. Our lighter ones are used more in other aspects. And then the very dark strong is usually an additive for industrial food processing. But you used to be able to buy grade A and grade B, which is these two. So the amber one was grade A and the darker one was grade B. Now grade B is now known as a dark color robust taste. So because grade B sounds like it's lower quality, which it really is not lower quality. It's just a matter of, taste and preference. When your syrup reaches its correct density and temperature, we remove the sugar sand before we hot pack it in containers. So we'll put our syrup through, you can use wool if you have that. They also make filters called Orlon filters, and you'll put your hot syrup through that. You can also, if you don't want to buy filters, and you can actually just let your syrup sit, and that sediment will settle to the bottom, and then you can pour the clear syrup back and reheat it. So we want to hot pack it between 180 and 190 when we put it for final storage. So this 180 to 190, hot packing it at that temperature is gonna, again, it's hot enough, there's no bacteria that are in it, no mold that would grow, and we put that lid on really fast, and that is going to prevent it from growing any, again, molds or bacteria while it's stored. Once you open a container of syrup, you do want to store that in the fridge after that. So again, syrup should be canned hot. 180 to 190 is the perfect temperatures. We pour that into hot sterilized canning jars and seal them. We do try to fill them as full as possible, so there's very little air in that jar. Again, this is to prevent any kind of space for microbes. And then it can be stored in a cool, dry place, but once the container's been opened, we must put that in the refrigerator. Should mold form on syrup that has been stored for several months, you'll want to discard that syrup because there could be contamination by a microorganism that could cause an illness. After the season's over, cleaning our equipment. So we clean with hot water. We don't use bleaches or detergents because they can leave residues that contaminate our syrup in the next year. So we just use brushes and cloths to scrub any buildup or scum that's developed on like buckets, any type of that type of system. And then if you're using tubing, you'll want to rinse that out and store it. And then filters, that's probably the hardest thing that I have to clean is that Orlon filter, because it has had the syrup go through it. So I rinse that, and I rinse it between, of course, try to rinse it out and let it dry in between each boil that we do. But it does tend to be the hardest thing to clean. And then you'll want to store your equipment in a dry area. And that, it sounds really easy, but it's a lot of steps. Again, in other trees, in recent years, there's been exploration of utilizing other tree species for syrup. Again, my specialty is black walnut. I'm stationed in the Ozarks, which we do not have a lot of maples to use for this. So I've been doing a lot of all black walnut tapping actually in syrup making. River birch is another one that can be used for syrup making. Again, a little bit harder to come by. And then there's a lot more research continuing to happen in this area. And I can, again, talk to black walnut syrup is that one of its, I guess, shortcomings compared to maple is that it has a lot of pectin in it. So I will filter it multiple times throughout the process of boiling it down to try and get as much of that pectin out as possible. Now, if you're very handy, some folks have been saving that pectin and using it to make jams and jellies. I've not gotten to that point. I usually just throw my pectin away. But some people are there and use it for that as well. So just kind of an interesting difference. Oh, and then you don't have to water bath it, no. So you just you have your syrup at that temperature when you jar it, and it will pop the lid as it cools. You just want to make sure you've sterilized those containers. And you're right. I always forget to mention box elder is another, and box elder is actually in the maple family, and there has been some sap collection and syrup making using them. That's right, Karen. Thanks for reminding me. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see the chat a lot easier. What does the pectin look like? So when I'm cooking initially, so my sap is still very watery, I will start to see kind of like, I'm trying to think it's a good term to describe it that doesn't sound too gross. It's kind of like wispy at first, wispy pieces of sediment that are in there. And sometimes while I'm cooking, I'll also just skim that out. And when you skim it out, it's kind of like a jelly looking clear substance that's kind of formed in the sap. So I will skim that out. And then when I go to move again, I do try to filter it a couple different times. So, and then I just read this morning, some folks have been saving the pectin and dehydrating it, and then making like a pectin powder that they're saving for later uses that you would use pectin for, which as far as I can tell is mostly jelly making. But yeah, it's good to know what it is, so we don't have nearly as much pectin in maple syrup. And so you do not see that same kind of formation. So if you're like looking at your sap as it's boiling, it's easy, oh my gosh, it's spoiled or it has mold in it, but it's really just that pectin that's being produced. So, and it's a fun, I enjoy making the syrup. It is labor intensive. At most of our farms where we're collecting, we use a bag system. So we just pull bags and dump into, and any type of container that you're putting sap into should be a food safe container. So for us, we get most of our kind of buckets for storage from bakeries and any place that has a lot of the bakeries and donut shops get their frosting in 5-gallon buckets, and then they will let us have those. You don't want to use things like pickle buckets or jalapeno buckets because they never, ever, ever will lose that smell and taste, and your sap will taste like that. So if it's from something that's either like a neutral taste or something that's kind of sweet like frosting, those are better food safe containers. Any other questions today? I should also say that between Missouri Department of Conservation and then some other, like the Daniel Boone Home in St. Charles, they have been doing some maple syruping workshops as well. So if you want to learn more, they're also out there. We're kind of reaching, usually like mid-March is kind of the end of the season because that's when our buds start to swell and we get closer to leaf out. And the sap will change flavor and it won't make a good syrup anymore. Yeah, so river birches, we give kind of that general rule of thumb of 10 inches, but they are hard to come by in that size class. I've been asked specifically if tapping has been documented as leading to any, death of a tree, and I can't say that we've at one of our research farms, we've been putting taps in 8-inch trees without any problems. So I think you could probably go smaller on the river birches, but just stick with the one tap. Say I have one, and many of you that have come to classes with me often. My husband's a hatchery manager for Missouri Department of Conservation, and they have a river birch that is probably every bit of at least 20 inches in diameter. And I was hoping I would tap it this year, and I just haven't gotten over there to throw a tap in to see what it was like, because it is a tree that's actually going to be lost. They'll have to cut it for a renovation that they're doing at the hatchery. So I said, how would be a good year to tap it before it's gone. I just haven't gotten it thrown in, but I have heard that the birch syrup is more, has a kind of minty flavor to it. Sources for getting taps, there's several companies. There's only one place that is technically Missouri based, which is a place called Isby's in St. Louis. I order most of mine online, and there's several different places. So there's Ross Sugar Bush, there's CDL, one called Evaporator, Vermont Evaporator. So you can use any of those sources. I know I've ordered from several of them, and all of them have been really fast to get stuff to me and have it delivered. So shipping and handling is a little pricey for some of it because it is heavy. I've also seen tapping kits. I know Roth Sugar Bush is one that has, you can kind of buy a kit and it gives you 12 taps, 12 bags and bag holders, and then the Orlon filter. So kind of everything you would need to get started in one kit. I've also seen similar on Amazon. So if you're looking for something to get even faster, Amazon does do that too. And then one of the best pans, so if you kind of have a setup where you can put a flat pan, you can get the restaurant chafing dishes and use that to boil your sap in. So, and I joke, I don't think I've seen two evaporating systems that look exactly the same, because everybody has some different setup that works for them. So cinder blocks, or converting like a burn barrel into its side, just all sorts of different things. You can buy evaporators as well. So it's a pre-made. One of the things that, especially if you're making a lot of syrup, is some type of blowing system will keep your fire hotter. So you have a blower that kind of blows on the fire and keeps it burning faster. You'll go through a lot of firewood, but it will help maintain that hotter temperature. So, and if you freeze sap, I recommend taking it out like 24 hours before you start to boil, because I did make the mistake of planning to boil from frozen on, and it took us a long time to get that defrosted, much less any evaporation to happen. Any other questions today? Thanks, Tabitha. Say this has been, I love the whole syrup making process. It's super fun. All right, so we have one more Friday, which is next week, and we're going to talk about timber stand improvement, which is kind of thinning the forest so that we can have optimal growth with our trees. Does apply even to our sugar bushes. So sometimes we do TSI to improve our trees that we use for syruping. So that'll be next week. And then after that, I should in the next couple of days have our March registration open. So that'll be available, and that'll be Mondays in March. All right. Have a great day.